the country. Uh, Thank you. With 100 people from all across the country joining in and helping us with this. So this effort that's coming together exactly a week after polls closed last week. We're going to talk about one of the big challenges that's facing the Democratic Party, and that's facing our ability to win elections and our ability to move forward as a party. This call is not meant to be a dissection of the Harris campaign, we're not going to be pointing fingers. We're not going to be blaming anyone. We're just talking about how we can move forward. The thing that we can do to help us win elections and to talk to the people that we need to talk to. So as we move through that, we have a couple of really smart people who are going to talk to you about all this at the end of this call, and we'll also send it via email. We're going to send a survey that lets you tell us what types of things you're interested in. So, we're looking at people who can help produce podcasts, who can edit, who are good on social media. What we're going to do here is connect you with other people who are interested in creating media and in engaging in these conversations online so that we can win people back. So we can grow the Democratic Party. We can help tell the story of why Democrats can be helpful and why we should be winning these elections. So we're going to go quickly through a whole bunch of really smart and interesting folks. First up is one of my dear, dear friends, Claudia Young. She's a researcher who looks at the manosphere and is just an incredibly brilliant person who looks at how these online right-wing communities form and what we can do to help combat that and to help tell a more compelling story. Claudia.
Thank you, Corey. Yes, so my research is looking at the mainstreaming of the manosphere, but when I submitted my thesis proposal 2 years ago, even though I was kind of starting to see the rhetoric and language of that originated in incel forums start to become used by, what we would call normies, I didn't even imagine then that Aiden Ross would be shouted out by Dana White in Trump's victory speech this year. So while my research looks a lot at the how and the why of the manosphere has become so popular, I don't necessarily have the answers to the problems that my research poses, but I'm hoping that some of the people on this call will. And I'm a big believer that it's important to properly understand the issue at hand if we're going to come up with effective and long-term solutions. So one of my favorite quotes that I've kind of come across fairly recently that I think describes a lot of what we're seeing is that conspiracy theorists, and I think this logic can be extended to the manosphere, is that they get the facts wrong, but the feelings right. And that's from Naomi Klein's book, Doppelganger. And similarly, while Ben Shapiro may say that facts don't care about your feelings, the opposite is also true, that feelings don't care about the facts. So sometimes I believe that responding to feelings with facts isn't necessarily an effective strategy. But what the manosphere is feeling is frustrated and angry. And the kind of manosphere influences both prey on and aggravate these feelings while scapegoating women and minorities in the process. But I also think that it's important that we take these feelings seriously because they're not unfounded, right? They've arisen from a legitimate sense of anxiety and instability due to the economic precarity that many young men face. But I also think that some important context is that this kind of white dude media ecosystem hasn't appeared out of nowhere. The far right has been laying the groundwork for this for years, and quite explicitly too. So the Breitbart doctrine, Andrew Breitbart, founder of Breitbart News, is kind of famous for saying politics is downstream from culture. So meaning that to change politics, you first have to change the culture. which results in the Overton window shifting further to the right. And so one of the ways we can see this having happened is, Breitbart News uplifting emerging right-wing figures like Ben Shapiro and Charlie Kirk, back when they were just kind of nascent in the reactionary conservative space. And the legitimization of right-wing figures through this doctrine has helped the formation of what the researcher Rebecca Lewis calls the alternative influence network, which is an assortment of scholars, media pundits, and internet celebrities who establish an alternative sense of credibility based on relatability, authenticity, and accountability, and cultivate an alternative social identity using the image of a social underdog and countercultural appeal. But I think, of course, the irony is that these figures are, even though they position themselves as countercultural, they're actually reinforcing hegemonic norms of racism and misogyny, albeit while using more inflammatory and politically incorrect language. But I also think that this kind of edginess is something that some of the more successful figures on the left who are popular amongst white men use successfully too, like Chapo Trap House and Hassan Piker. Um, and then, there are also so many other reasons why this manosphere has become so mainstream. Of course, they're leveraging algorithms, which privilege reactionary content. And also they have, the leaders of the social media companies personally invested in uplifting voices on the right, Musk being kind of prime example. And then another way that they leverage these algorithms is that because they kind of have no regard for fact checking, they can kind of pump out a lot of content really quickly without having to kind of go through traditional editorial processes that, people who value fact-based analysis do. So I'm aware that I don't have a lot of time, but this is a very, very complex issue that I could talk about for hours. But I thought that just to finish, I would share a section of kind of a social media post I shared kind of in the days after the election, in response to, I guess, a lot of the separationist discourse I was seeing. So as cathartic as it may feel to place the blame squarely on young men, I think it's incredibly reductive and only plays into the problem that decades of austerity measures have created. That young men feel rightfully frustrated and left behind, unable to secure stability in a world that places systemic failures on the individual. Throughout my research, I maintained that it's necessary to have some level of compassion towards the young men who are drawn to the manosphere, even when they're spewing some of the most horrific views imaginable. If our response is to further isolate them, we'll be pushing them further down the radicalization pipeline and we'll be in an even worse place than before. So I think that this call hopefully is like the start of trying to reach out to these young men, because I fundamentally believe that these people are not evil or terrible or inherently bad. They're just kind of responding to a lot of the material inequality that they're facing. So that's my little spiel done. Happy to, if anyone has any questions or wants to discuss this further, I'm also very happy to chat further after this call. But I think I'm now introducing Sahib. Is that right, Corey?
Yes, but we have a very special guest that we're going to bring in just before. And if you have questions for Claudia, please put them in the chat, and then we will also make sure that Claudia gets them. So next up, we have a very special guest joining us. We have Representative Anna Eskamani coming in from Florida, who is an absolute hero and has been doing a lot of work over these last few years on everything from healthcare to education. And I will let Representative Eskamani take it away from here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I first just want to say thank you so much for convening this call, and what an excellent presentation by Claudia as well. And I echo some of the closing points that she made around this is not a time for isolation. It's not a time for any one of us to also shrink. is a time for us to get loud and proud for who we are and our values, and to inspire others to join us in action. And again, my name is Ana Villascamani. I am proudly serving District 42 in the Florida State Legislature. So shit is wild in Florida, as y'all can imagine. It is tough being a Floridian. But I am a daughter of immigrants. I'm born and raised in this sweet town, went to county public schools, K-12, and the University of Central Florida. And of course, my entryway into politics really comes from my childhood of experiencing what it's like to struggle to make ends meet, of finding support in the public institutions that cared about me and allowed me to thrive. And my mom passed away when I was just 13 years old, and it was those social safety nets that protected me and supported me, whether it was the SSI my dad received until my sister and I turned 18, or the public scholarship that allowed me to go to college. And so we have to, of course, reflect on the reasons why we're here, because it's much greater than just the fear of Trump. For me, it's about the fact that families like mine are going to be left behind despite of the populist rhetoric. We know that so much of what is actually going to be coming out of this administration is damaging to our environment, damaging to these essential public institutions, damaging to our planet, and create an environment where the haves and have-nots will only continue to spread deeper into despair. And so the work of each one of you here and the conversation that we're having tonight is so essential, because it not only speaks to the fact that we are willing to admit where faults were made and where improvements must be addressed, but we're also willing to dust ourselves up a week after what is a disastrous election result to say we can and must do better. And that's what we're leading on in Florida, because yes, I won my reelection and I'm proud of it. In fact, I flipped my seat in 2018 and I've kept it blue since then. And in that time frame, also created a voter registration organization, and we've registered over 10,000 students to vote at public universities in the Sunshine State. We've also championed reproductive rights with Amendment 4, and as many of you might know, we were able to secure 57% for reproductive rights in Florida to end the near total abortion ban, which is not enough to amend Florida's state constitution, but it still sends a clear message to extremism that collectively we're not going to accept this reality for the women and girls of Florida. And so we really have to find solidarity in spaces like this, but also realize that we are up against an anti-democratic movement that is autocratic and that flourishes off the isolation of people, that flourishes off the misinformation that is spread on digital platforms. And one that, of course, is funded by major hedge fund owners, by billionaires like Elon Musk, who will benefit from the division, who benefit from the working class struggling, who would ultimately benefit from the formation of a government that is run by the richest of Americans that leaves everyone else behind. And so in the content that you create and the conversations that you have, I think it's so important to center that on the needs of everyday people, on solving solutions, on preventing the co-opting of our ideas. I think what frustrates me the most is when some of these MAGA extremists take progressive ideas and say that they belong to them. Like, we need a fact check, but again, not in a way that pushes people to the side, but opens the door for self-reflection and dialogue. I always lead with wonder when I knock on doors. And I always ask the question, what keeps you up at night? It's my favorite question to ask, because it allows us to take the elevator down and actually feel and listen to people. And even if the conversation is one revolving around, for example, their discomfort with the existence of trans people, which of course is so painful for me to hear. I know it is my job not to push back on that person and say that they are vile and evil, but to help educate them away from a place of fear to a place of understanding. And that doesn't happen with one door knock. It doesn't happen in one conversation. It happens with building a relationship with your audience. In my case, my constituents, but in your case, your listeners, your followers, the random person scrolling on their TikTok feed, right? And so I thank you for being part of this work. I thank you for wanting to do this work, because it's so easy to just turn away and say, I'm disconnecting and I'm moving on. And so I just thank you for being a part of it. I know that we're here with you too, and you can follow us online at Anna for Florida, 2N, all spelled out. We're active on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, still Twitter, though I fucking hate being there. And of course, activating on Threads and Blue Sky. And so we're YouTube, and we're also very active on YouTube. So keep in touch with us. Know that we got your back, and that I'm really just thrilled for this conversation. And I'm really excited that you're excited and engaged on it too. I'm going to drop, just for your interest, for any Florida folks in the room, we are hosting a Zoom ourselves tomorrow night. It is titled Prepare and Protect, Facing Trump 2025 Together. And I will drop that in the Zoom link if you have interest in joining us. We'll introduce you to local nonprofits who are leading the work in defending our communities and our constitutional rights. And so I am invite you to join us for that space as well. Thanks so much again for having me.
Thank you so much, Anna. And we will pitch over to Sohaib.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. So my name's Sohaib Hassan. I work at Meta as a data science manager, but I'm very much a political junkie, and I drove the data science response for Meta's election efforts during this cycle. So I'll spend just a few minutes. We talked about like, hey, how did we get here? But I think what I want to anchor on is like, first of all, where are we exactly? What happened? So I'll spend some time basically going on like, what do we know about exactly how this election turned out? And then what do we know about why things moved the way that they did? And I'll start with just like a note of caution. The like ballots are still being counted. There's still quite like millions of ballots that are still in the mail. We don't know all of the answers here. It's actually going to take months to, do the full proper deep dives. And a lot of this is based on like projections, exit polls. So there's, a degree of uncertainty, but I think the broad contours of what happened and why it happened are becoming fairly clear through a number of different signals. So what happened? I think the basic thing that happened is that the entire country shifted red by 6 points. That is ultimately like the single most important reason that the election in 2020 went one way and this one went another way. The country moved. Turnout is about the same. Again, this is a projection. We're counting ballots still, but turnout is looking like it's about the same from 2020 to 2024. People just cast different ballots this time around. Yes, there are a few more people that stayed home, but the biggest thing that happened is people pulled one lever one time and another lever the other time. So who changed their mind? What's interesting is that we're seeing when we look at the demographic breakdowns, and again, like this is not meant to cast blame, just like purely descriptive. By and large, the shift from blue to red was driven by non-white voters. There was a concentrated shift, or like that shift was the highest among Hispanic voters, male voters, and young voters. And every time you kind of like stack those things on top of each other, you see like a bigger and bigger swing. So generally, we see that white voters shook out about even. If they were kind of more rural leaning, they swung a little bit more, whereas urban not as much. Interestingly, the black vote seems like it has not moved, which kind of like cuts at some of the working class talking points that you hear. It's hard to sometimes reconcile some of those with the fact that the black vote is fairly consistent from 2020 to 2024. The Asian vote, which encompasses generally like South Asia as well as Asia writ large, there was a solid about 5-point shift there as well, but the biggest shift was among Hispanic voters, which is about 13 points. And then the other biggest shift was among 18 to 29 demographic, where we saw shifts of about 15, 20 points from 2020, pretty seismic. Having said that, those are all about like the shifts in the margin. The coalition itself, the makeup of the party was actually about the same from 2020 to 2024. So the archetypal blue voter is still non-white, millennial, suburban, college-educated woman. Whereas the kind of archetypal red voter in this cycle is the same as it was in 2020. White, rural, Gen X, non-degree holding, and men. Also worth noting is that while the country as a whole shifted about 6-7 points, swing states swung much less, about 2 to 3 points, which does kind of suggest that like the Harris campaign did mitigate a lot of these forces that were at play in this election. So that's a basic idea of what happened. Why did it happen? And again, this is all based on us, various survey entities asking voters, why did you do what you did? And the fundamentals of the story there are, again, fairly consistent, and they've actually been consistent for nearly a year now. And the story has consistently been inflation, immigration, and a perception of a overly or too much attention being paid to culture war issues versus kind of kitchen table issues among the Biden and the Harris campaign. Inflation is number one, first and foremost, by far. It's the thing that pops at the top of the list every single time, no matter how you cut it. And this was a global phenomenon. We saw just, frankly, a wipeout of incumbents globally in election after election after election. And the Harris campaign actually performed relatively well compared to that. But the post-COVID bout of inflation that hit the entire world was a massive headwind to not only the Harris campaign, but every campaign that's happened in democracies across the world. Other than inflation, number two consistently has been immigration. People who felt that, who believed that border crossings were out of control were consistently, like, the more fear that people felt about immigration and border crossings, the more likely they were to vote for Trump. And then there's this bit kind of about culture war issues, where there's a perception among Trump voters that the Harris campaign was not speaking to their needs. They were speaking, or were more advocating for kind of culture war issues like trans rights and things like that. You know, the famous ad of like Harris is for they, them, and not for you, which is kind of designed to be a wedge, to create a wedge within the party. And it, you know, fair or not, it was effective. The last kind of thing that plays into kind of all of these were what I don't want to frame as misinformation, but what I'll call kind of outdated understandings. So we know that if you look at the scorecard of like the economy and border crossings today, inflation is at historical norms. Unemployment is at, you know, record lows and has been for some time. Border crossings have come down. Crime has come down. However, perceptions take time to catch up, and the people who believe that we are in a recession, the people who believe that border crossings are still very high, the people who believe that crime is at historic high, were the folks who swung the hardest. So even though a lot of those upticks in crime, inflation, and border crossings are a few years in the past at this point, the stink of it is something that we carried forward with us throughout the entirety of this campaign and was a consistent drag. And you consistently see that the folks who kind of have updated their understanding of the economy to where it's at today, and for all those other issues, were consistently more likely to vote blue and versus not. I'll pause there, but I think that's kind of like the broader the shake of how things shook out. Is the country shifted red, and it was largely because of inflation, immigration, crime, culture war. And the shifts that we saw were generally much more focused in non-swing states than swing states. But I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Sohaib. We're going to go over now, speaking of those conversations, we're going to go over now to Catherine Stoudemire, who's going to talk to us a little bit about how we can engage on social media and why that's an important aspect for us to help move those conversations forward.
Thanks, Corey. And yes, I am here to chat everyone's favorite topic, which is social media. Similar to everyone's points kind of in the chat and throughout this call, I think that we are past the point in time where arguing with someone on Facebook is really going to make headway. And so how are we developing and generating social media content that is breaking through the noise in a really meaningful way? And so I think that I'll start by saying a lot of what we see on these platforms and a lot of what we saw in this election as a whole is that people have a tendency to get stuck in their social media echo chambers, right? I know that we all have those stories of when we're chatting with friends and talking about latest trends and things we're seeing on social media. One friend always says something that you have never heard of or seen in your entire life. And it's because they are just on an entirely separate part of the internet. And that's a little bit of what we see happening with politics. With especially like partisan content as a whole, we find that Democratic voters get stuck in their social media echo chambers where they're receiving content from Democrats, they're engaging with content from Democrats, and so they're going to continue receiving that content. And we're seeing it on the flip side with Republicans. right? And we're saying that that's where misinformation has an opportunity to manifest because key voices are being brought up into part of the conversation on an ongoing basis. So, how do we break through that noise and how do we get our message to those people? One of the most important elements is to really employ an agile approach when we're thinking about social media. The trends and culture are constantly changing. And so, how are we capitalizing on current trends and culture in a really meaningful way that gets our message across to these audiences? Because at the end of the day, like, let's take this exact moment in time, for example. Most people who are on TikTok as a platform right now are saying something about the movie Wicked or saying something about Christmas because it is never too early to put up your tree, apparently, in some parts of the country. So, how are we like capitalizing on those conversations to kind of start pushing subliminal messaging that gets people to think really critically about the role that politics play in their lives? To Sohib's point, people were really, really focused on inflation. So we're already starting to see some of these lifestyle content creators who are developing content to kind of help track inflation rates. I happen to live on the food side of the internet. When I get online, all I want to see are things to do with food. And so one of my favorite creators the other day who came out in support of Kamala Harris throughout the election started posting her grocery receipts every single week to track and see, is our price of eggs really going to decrease as we progress? And so I think that brings me to this next point, which is people have to stick within their niche and develop content that resonates to the audience that they're already speaking to. And so, how are we weaving to that effect those subliminal political messages into our everyday content and inspiring that critical thought and the opportunity to get in front of voices that we are not always in front of? Because at the end of the day, like most lifestyle content creators, aren't outwardly speaking about their political views. But there are small things that they can be doing, like that receipt thing that I mentioned, that allow their followers to like think really critically about the role that politics play in their everyday lives. And so I think that to bring us kind of full circle, some ways that you can identify those trends, because I think that when we're starting on social media, I think that's what everyone wants to know about and think about. So some ways to get out of the echo chamber: subscribe to some newsletters. They give you really great insights in terms of things that are trending and content that could possibly break through the noise. In my job, I know that I often have to identify trends really quickly. So I have an entirely separate social media account that doesn't have a login, isn't associated to me. I'm not spending time on it curating my feed. And so top trending content is just going to automatically populate. So it gives me a really great indicator of what is current at the current time. So I know that that was really speedy. I know that 5 minutes isn't enough to fully dive into the role that social media plays in an election or in our lives as a whole, but hopefully that gives you some tangible, tactical walkaway points. I saw someone in here already excited about motorsports, which I think is really cool and is a really great way to break through the noise. So I am excited about that. And I think that the number one thing that drives social media is meaningful content. And so I'm so excited to hand it over to Roman Papadimitriou, who is the co-founder and CEO of Mutuals Media, a startup media network and production studio for short-form video. He's previously been at Center for American Progress, was one of the first employees at Crooked Media, and is going to give you guys some really awesome insights.
Awesome. Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, so I'm going to share some slides real quick and hopefully move through them even faster. Sorry, can you all see that? Are my slides up here?
Yep, we can see him.
All right, thanks. Great. So I'm specifically going to talk to you all about video on social media. So to start a little bit about the landscape. So as you can see here, people are only spending more and more time online, and especially the next generation of voters. So this chart here shows that our next generation of voters, US teens, are spending 5 hours a day on social media. In particular, they're spending most of that time on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. So that's where Mutual's media is focused. Most of its efforts is reaching people where they are on those platforms. Our kind of thesis is the same way that kind of these younger generations are interacting with TikTok and YouTube is the way older generations have interacted with TV. And the right wing is already kind of understanding this. I'm sure you all have seen plenty of stories and kind of early postmortems about how Trump went on all these kind of right-wing podcasts and this network of influencers. And that's because they kind of understand this is how to reach that young generation, the generation of young men that we've kind of been talking about. And they're doing it by focusing on entertainment first, culture first media, not necessarily expressly political media. So they're, yeah, like I mentioned, they're focused on culture and entertainment and not politics. And the other thing that's really interesting about this kind of network of right-wing organizations is that they are run as businesses. They're always on. They are kind of like how we want our kind of ground game organizing organizations to be, is constantly organizing. They're constantly pushing out messages, constantly shaping the views of their audience, and constantly pushing them to respond and push back on elected officials. So they're kind of priming them for any political moment that might arise. So that is kind of where Mutual's media sees an opportunity. Is there's actually kind of, if you look at the bottom right part of this chart, it's kind of like a crude map of the digital media landscape as we kind of see it. The progressive actually have really invested in building up digital media. We have Crooked, they're More Perfect Union, some other organizations, but those reach people who are already really engaged, and kind of we see the opportunity as sort of a Barstool Sports for the left, where you're reaching those folks who are less engaged in politics, but every once in a while you can kind of talk about your political opinions and views that way. So the right has, or sorry, the kind of progressive organizations have kind of started to take this into account. Vice President Harris went on a really interesting kind of social media TikTok show. And that is kind of what we see as the future of digital media and social video. So we think that TikTok is only starting to look more and more like TV. And so these social first shows are able to grow massive audiences really quickly. So yeah, Vice President Harris went on a game show called Trackstar, where you have to kind of guess what song you're listening to in order to win $5. Tim Walz went on a show called Subway Takes. And these shows, we think that this is going to be kind of the next wave of kind of TV shows, because in the same way that streamers were acquiring podcast rights back in the day, we think that, you know, Amazon Prime is going to partner with a Subway Takes, and that will be the next kind of big smash hit TV show. So that's what we're building with Mutuals. We're building Barstool Sports for the left. We're a media studio creating smash viral hits where people actually are on TikTok, Instagram Reels, and YouTube. We started this year with 2 shows. The first was a show called Gaydar. It's about kind of centering the LGBTQ community. It's supposed to be really funny, really lighthearted. It had just racked up already 50 million views this election cycle. And it also works in some subtle, but some not as subtle hits on Republicans who are anti-LGBTQ rights. And then we had a second show in collaboration with Now This that is a lot more, is targeted towards young men. So it's kind of an explainer series, a take on drunk history, where you have a young content creator who drinks a bunch of beers and tries to explain a political concept to the audience. And what's really interesting, there are already some tools that kind of show political impact of things like this. So you can actually test their effectiveness, although that's still kind of being worked out. Yeah, so our kind of theory is we're going to work with more content creators to build new original series, and then that'll become kind of like a network where they're kind of cross-pollinating, and people can kind of reinforce their audiences that way. This is kind of our services. But if anyone wants to chat about kind of anything I mentioned about the digital media environment and how to kind of grow their social media platforms, we're happy to partner either through a kind of our white label studio or provide any production support that we have. Because yeah, our focus will be mostly on cultivating these kind of younger content creators who want to build entertainment first shows, but we're open to helping all sorts of people get their messages out. So you can reach me at roman@mutualsmedia.com. I will drop all my information there. All right. I'm going to pass it over to Liam Billingham. Liam is a freelance podcast producer who spent 5 years as an executive and producer at Sugar 23 in Hollywood, where he developed and produced podcasts for Time Magazine, Audible, and a variety of other in-house productions. Prior to his time in Hollywood, Liam was a project manager in public access and community media in Brooklyn, New York, creating training programs in podcasting, documentary, and fiction filmmaking. Liam co-hosts and produces Die Hard on a Blank, a podcast about the history of action movies with a slightly progressive bent.
Thanks, Roman. Hi, everybody. My name's Liam Billingham. That was nice of you to read my bio. It saves me the time of having to do it. Look, I do not have a presentation. I thought that was really impressive, but I did want to just get on here and talk a little bit about podcasting's role in this whole situation. So I feel as though podcasting has been around for a long time. I feel like most people at this point have listened to a podcast. I won't explain, what a podcast is, but I think it has played more and more of a pivotal role in our politics over, let's say, the last decade. It was a big moment in 2015 when when Barack Obama went on Mark Maron's podcast. It was like a big explosion. Suddenly there was this, space where you could have the sitting president come on and talk freely and openly. And that's something that separates podcasting, I think, from short video on, YouTube or Instagram or any of these platforms. Podcasts allows you to go deep. It allows you to have a long conversation and get sort of past the 30-second, 1 minute, 10-minute kind of video thing that video does, right? So, as we're looking at the postmortem of this election, I've seen people call it the first podcast election. Trump went on Theo Vaughn's show. He went on Joe Rogan. Rogan endorsed him the day before the election or the day of the election. Kamala went on Call Her Daddy. And so you were seeing more politicians on these shows, but it isn't really about the candidate being on the podcast. I think that podcasts can serve the function of presenting a worldview that can come through whether you're talking about politics or not, right? If you look at the top podcasts right now on Apple Podcasts, they're quite conservative leaning. As a lot of digital media seems to be, very successful digital media, they kind of own those top 8 spots on the podcast space, and it's been building for a long time. And that in a way is discouraging, but I think the opportunity here to get the word out and to be kind of create a more progressive role for podcasting in culture is to remember that it's relatively cheap and very easy to make a podcast and to publish it and to reach a large audience. That's one of the appealing things about it. It can be audio, video, or both, and it can be hosted lots of places. Shows can be on YouTube, they can be on Apple Podcasts, they can be on Spotify. They're easy to access. They're traditionally, free, and they're ad supported. And I think the most important thing about podcasts is that they can create a real parasocial relationship with the hosts. The medium is very intimate, especially when you're just listening to it. I listen to podcasts in my car. I listen to podcasts when I'm running. And it really has found a way, I think, to hook people and to really, in some ways, quite negatively, allow the worldview of the hosts to become the worldview of the audience. It's a very powerful tool in that sense, because you can listen to it anywhere and you can spend your time engaging with it wherever you happen to be. And again, because of the nature of it being long form, clips can be taken and posted to social media, to YouTube. It's a format that can play in a lot of different places. An hour-long conversation can go all over the place and be shared in a lot of variety of ways. More than that, and along to the point of the parasocial nature of it, people trust podcasters, right? A lot of studies have done into looking at the fact that podcasts that do ads are often, the hosts are trusted more than a television ad. It's a really great place to sell a product because oftentimes it's coming from the host of the show. They're the one reading the copy. They're the one selling the product. So it makes it feel like they are selling, that this person is using an item or something that you might yourself. And I think that feeds into how we think about the politics, that the view of the host can become your worldview. And so, how do we combat this? I think there needs to be more shows that are not just focused on politics, that can cover a wide range of subjects. Someone mentioned motorsports, that have a left-leaning or progressive mentality, whatever you want to call it. I have already started to see shows pop up over the last, let's say, week that are kind of trying to launch a progressive podcast in the time that now in this moment, or have been planning to do this. So it's already starting. I dropped a show called Jess and John into the chat, which is hosted by Jessica Burbank, about a lot of these issues. I think we're going to be seeing more of it. I would encourage folks to look at the shows that they're already subscribed to on their phone, on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and see what the related media looks like, see what the related shows are. Stop looking candidly on social media for podcasts, especially X, and start looking at Patreon, Substack, start looking at what other people are subscribing to, because discovery is the biggest challenge. But I think if you look in your feeds, if you look at where you listen to your shows, not on social media, you'll be able to find more progressive shows that you can share out into the world. And I think that's the big thing. I would encourage folks to try to band together in this moment with your various sets of skills. You need hosts, you need technicians, you can need editors, and launching a new show is not that difficult. And I'm sure that we can chat more about what that might look like. But that's all for me. I'm available if you have questions. Thanks. And I believe, should I introduce Lindsay? Sorry.
Yes, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So I'm introducing Lindsay Scola. Lindsay is a writer, speaker, producer, and strategist who leads at the nexus of entertainment and political change. She has over 20 years working on core teams of high-powered, influential leaders across media, entertainment, politics, and government. And she's passionate about expanding patient advocacy and normalizing conversations about sleep disorders. So, Lindsay, take it away.
Hi, thank you for reading my little bit random bio. I came into the world in politics and then had a switch over to entertainment in a moment that I was fed up with politics, and had this sort of epiphany at some point that the reason I was so passionate about this intersection on TV and politics and how it comes together is that when I was an organizer for Barack Obama in 2007 at the University of Iowa, I had all of these kids that I was organizing who were apoplectic, that none of the candidates were in favor of gay marriage. And when you dug in with them why that was, it wasn't their identity, it wasn't a friend's identity, a family identity. They grew up watching Will and Grace. And we have seen that we have the data that when people are watching something that they perceive as very intimate, a conversation in their living room, they feel unjudged and they feel like they can come to a conclusion on their own without sort of being forced in a way that they feel from a politician or even from the news. And oftentimes when we have these conversations about big TV moments, and was lamenting with a friend yesterday that we have never needed Norman Lear more than in the year that we've lost him, we talk about these shows from the 70s. It's the abortion moment on Maude, or the first interracial kiss on Star Trek in the 60s. And we forget that when people were watching those shows, a third of the people watching television in that given moment were watching that show. So we are never, ever, ever going to have the same sort of eyes, hearts, minds on any given storyline ever again. However, I do want to give a little bit of a history lesson about how TV was incredibly effective for moving health education in the 90s and early 2000s, which has been where my big focus has been recently as a person with narcolepsy, of how do we get TV to change the way that we talk about sleep disorders? Because when I was diagnosed after having symptoms for 20 years, I looked at my doctor and said, I don't think you're right. I've never fallen asleep into a bowl of soup, because the only thing I could see in my head was this image from Deuce Bigelow, Male Gigolo, with the woman falling asleep into a bowl of soup. So when we actually look at things that started in ER, late 90s, early 2000s, we start seeing minor storylines where a teen with burns from a workplace incident also gets diagnosed with hypertension, and they're advised to improve their diet. This particular episode was helped by the CDC and the USC Keck School of Medicine, and they were promoting the 5-a-day program. It was a very minor storyline in this episode, but when they polled ER viewers afterwards, 65% were more likely to adapt healthier habits, and many discussed the episode with their friends and family, so it spreaded this message beyond just the people who are watching, and they saw a bigger change in the attitudes of this with men than with women. And then similarly, we start seeing this with HIV/AIDS across the shows in the late 90s and 2000s, where it's no longer this big life-changing storyline on one episode, but very small, often the C storyline or even a small runner. And so when we look at the numbers of shows that were doing this in the 90s, Becker, The District, Enterprise, Star Trek, Touched by an Angel, Girlfriends, Half and Half, One on One, Soul Food, Presido Med, Queer as Folk, and that's just a small number. We don't remember half of those shows. However, it's really hard to think about television in this time period without remembering the sort of all-encompassing nature of how we saw this content playing out. Similarly, when we started seeing this content move into soap operas, we start seeing 1/3 of people who are watching soap operas saying that they are changing one of their daily habits or something about their health based on what they were watching. And we start seeing numbers just rise across. So there was an episode of Bold and the Beautiful in 2001 where a character is diagnosed with ADHD and discloses his status to his fiance. They did a PSA at the end of the episode that had a call line, which is a little bit different than what we have now. But just to show the sort of influx of numbers, we see 88 calls on this hotline the day before, 1,400 calls during the episode, and then 1,800 calls following that. And we sort of start seeing this over and over again as we look at these different types of shows. I want to bring up a particular study from 2015 where Hollywood Health and Society centered this study around the show Royal Pains, which researchers found that viewers who watched one episode featuring a transgender character developed a significantly more positive attitude towards transgender people and related policies than when they looked at an episode from the show Transparent. Why is this? Well, the entire show of Transparent was centered around a transgender character. So there was some level of signing on to this concept when you agreed to watch it. However, Royal Pains, some viewers, this is the first transgender interaction that they're ever having. Crucially, the cumulative effect of seeing multiple transgender portrayals across different shows amplified these attitudes threefold. And then they looked at the largest news source at the time, which was Caitlyn Jenner's story, and the views skyrocketed from the TV show and not from the news coverage. So as we see 2 or more transgender narratives at this time, it reduces even the influence of political ideology of people who were coming in before they watched these shows. So we see this across designated driver campaigns, sex education, immunization, racial equality, and foster care. Some of the most successful campaigns are the designated driver campaign, which just in 1 year of running content, which was often not even a storyline, but just one piece of dialogue, 9 in 10 adults, specifically 89%, had a positive, favorable about the concept and were using it in their daily lives, and nearly 100% of 18 to 24 we're viewing designated driver favorably because of this. And we see this over and over again with sex education and with immunization. Mr. Rogers getting his shot, and that really changed attitudes across the way. Another more recent ways that we've seen this work very successfully in a small way, an episode from This Is Us, where the character Randall is about to have his first baby and ends up interacting with a Sikh American in the hardware store and is talking to him about a ceiling fan issue, but then ends up asking him questions about raising children and getting wisdom. And the guy asks him, "Why me?" To which he responds something about his turban and Eastern wisdom, and the guy tells him he's from East Trenton, and that we see a very favorable response of people seeing people who are similar to them in a way that they were not expecting. So not all of us are going to be in writers' rooms or working on a scripted show. However, I think the big takeaway here, as we're starting to look of having more content that's smaller, that's shaping these things, is to not think that the overarching storyline, which we've talked about with podcasts and with digital media, that every successful point we've had on this across the board has really been small incremental change. And remember that the number of viewers who are watching things are so much smaller. But likely if you're watching one medical show, you're watching 2, 3, 4. And if you start seeing concepts across the board, it's going to get you to think about it a little bit more. So with that, I want to introduce Corey, who probably needs very little introduction at this point. But Corey Alpert is a PhD researcher at the University of Melbourne, looking at the impact of AI on democracy. He is also the chief strategist of Field Team 6, the nation's largest partisan voter registration organization. He served for 3 years in the Biden-Harris administration as an advanced lead. That's where Corey and I met. And prior to that, as the state's chief of staff to Pete Buttigieg's 2020 campaign, and as the senior advisor to Mayor Steve Benjamin.
Well, thank you, Lindsay, and thank you to everyone who has joined us today, to all of our speakers, to everyone joining us all across the country and all across the world. Especially thank you to Claudia coming in from Melbourne, Australia. These conversations are really important, and what we're going to be able to do in these next 2 and 4 years is really important in telling these stories. Like Lindsay said in her closing, this isn't about creating huge culture shifting, TV shows that are about going in, directly and combating, one thing or another. It's about telling these stories and putting these stories out in a way that changes attitudes over time and helps soften people and helps bring people along to what we're doing. So in terms of next steps, we're going to drop a survey in the chat for you to stay in touch. So this is where you can tell us what you are able to do and how you want to plug in. So if you are an audio editor and you want to help out with a podcast, let us know in that. If you are a video editor or a producer, or if you want to host something on camera, however you can help tell those stories, put that in the survey that's going to come in. We'll also email you that survey, and please share that around. The more people who can connect in, who can tell us what they're passionate about, what their skills are, the better. The more that we're able to do that, and the more people who are able to plug in, what we're going to be doing on the back end here is connecting the dots. So we will help connect, if you have a great idea. We've been in the chat talking a lot about a motorsports show. If you want to help edit or produce that show or help distribute it, great, get in touch, add that into the chat, and we'll be connecting those pieces. Likewise, if you're someone who thinks a lot about these issues and wants to help advise some of these shows or wants to help think through how we continue to do all this work, please let us know. So for anyone in the chat who's offering help, please put that in the survey, and we will certainly be in touch. If you have questions for any of our speakers, we'll be getting this transcript over to them, and we'll be getting contact information out for folks who need it. But please keep in touch. My email is in the RSVP link to this event. It's just Corey@fieldteam6.org. We thank you all. It's been a tough week for everyone. And I think this is another really good first step as we look towards rebuilding and look towards staying in this fight, because the next couple of years are going to be really dark, and there are going to be things that hurt a lot of people, and we can't look away, and we have to stay in the work and have to do everything that we can to find ways to win. And that's what this is all about. So thank you all so much. We'll leave this open for another couple minutes if folks want to finish out anything in the chat, but please fill out that survey. Please keep in touch and follow each other on social and help build this community, because that's what this is all about, and help us move forward. So thank you all so much, and have a great rest of your evening.